Hi guys, so today we're going to go over sectionalism 1820 to 1860, and this is chapter 9 of your textbook. This is a very critical section because what it does is it sets the stage for things to come. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is going to be elected president, and the South is going to secede from the Union. And the reason that they secede is they feel that the differences between the North and the South are just so great that they don't want to remain in the Union any longer. Plus, it threatens their way of life, which of course is wrapped all around slavery. So let's get through it. It says here there are 89 slides. Most of those are pictures. There's really not that much information in here, but it's important for you to grasp all of the concepts that are going on because it makes everything else easier to understand. Okay, so here are the different sections. And I have been teaching American history for a long time. And in Pageant and other books, the West was considered where we are. This book puts the West west of the Mississippi River. There aren't very many people living out there at that time. So this is kind of the concept of what's going on at this time, but there were regional differences, and it's based upon the economic activity that's going on there, of course, slavery in the South, transportation, the number of people, their culture, their belief systems, and a lot of different things. Okay, so let's talk about the East first. The East dominated, right? If you look at it, you can see the population density up there between Boston, what we call the megalopolis right now. So it's up here from Boston all the way down to DC. It's very densely populated. It was before, but it continued to grow like that. So you don't have very many densely populated areas in the South, but you definitely do in the Northeast. And the reason for that is because a lot of immigrants are moving there and they want the factory jobs that have developed as a result of the market revolution. So, what the book says is that we take in two parts of the North. And as I said in the past, this had been considered the West, but now we're looking at, whoops, I gave Virginia because Virginia and Kentucky are not part of the North, right? So it's that area right there. That is the North that's located up there. And as it says to the left here too. So they're bound together by these transportation links that were created between 1820 and 1840, canals, roads, railroads even that we start to be seen or start to show up too and be built. So that connects these areas, and they're the most populated region, and so they're experiencing all sorts of population growth at this time. Okay, so labor becomes an issue. Now we know labor is handled in the South through slavery, but what's happening in the North is that everything is impersonal. We're going through this huge shift as we enter into the industrial revolution, where people used to be responsible for themselves on a day-to-day basis, and they didn't have to answer to some obscure boss, right? And work certain hours. They could get up and work in their field when they wanted to, feed their animals when they wanted to. Instead, they're living in these cities, and they call them here spindle cities, areas where there's clusters of workers who are paid low wages, and they live and work in poor conditions. It's weird that we look at it this way, though, because actually the standard of living for most people improved during the Industrial Revolution. So if we look at the conditions where they're living and working, there is child labor, and as you saw from the video in class, people didn't really think anything of that. Children were expected to work and do their chores at home and then do things to contribute to the family. So there was child labor, unsanitary working conditions, there was poor housing, there were diseases in these cities that ran rampant, like dirty water would result in epidemics of cholera and other things, and people really didn't know how to explain that. People were working long hours for little pay, so their working conditions were bad. Initially, it wasn't so bad when there weren't that many people But when there was competition for labor, as more and more people moved to the United States, then you could fire people easily and then just get someone else off the street and you can pay them very little wages. So people start to attempt to organize. And even though you haven't gotten the lecture yet for chapter 8, in there I talk about how it was very difficult for them to unionize at this time. They're only going to be able to do that once we get skilled labor, and that's going to be the Knights of Labor, but that's down the road quite a bit. If you look to the right here, there are those attempts, but because there's periods of depression, because employers, states, and the courts looked unfavorably at unions, and because there was just a vast pool of people to pull from for your labor source, then they really couldn't get a foothold and they couldn't organize. One good thing, though, was Commonwealth versus Hunt. This is a Supreme Court case in 1842 where the Supreme Court upheld the right of people to unionize if it's done peacefully, right? And so they had the right to negotiate labor contracts. Many of these workers align with the Democratic Party that's seen as the party of the people, especially after Andrew Jackson. One thing we're going to get is a 10-hour workday, though, under Martin Van Buren. He follows Andrew Jackson in 1840, but that's only for federal employees, and then other people are going to follow. What you're going to see is that the federal government, because of the Interstate Commerce Clause, they didn't feel that they could regulate the commerce that was taking place within a state only if it went from state to state. During the Great Depression, none of that matters. FDR and the Democrats make all sorts of laws that really went beyond, many people would argue, the scope of the Constitution and really changed things dramatically. Okay, so in these cities, if you can see this drawing, you couldn't get an image of it because cameras, they didn't take pictures of it. There were some, but usually they're dated late that I could find. But they're rat infested. People are still throwing human waste out into the street. Plus, you have all these animals out there too. They would have pigs in the street that would eat the garbage. You see here some kids playing in the garbage heap, and a woman looks like she's picking through it. But here, a court for King Cholera. If, for example, there was a meat packing plant and they were dumping stuff into a creek, and then that creek was polluted with that waste, people drink that water, then they would get very sick, and it was a disease that spread. So cities were not really nice places. They were filthy. They smelled horrible. They were cesspools, right? So we see this rapid urbanization that's taking place in the North during this time. And if you look at that first bullet point, between 1800 and 1850, the percent of people living in urban areas increased from 5% to 15%. Currently, the majority of the population in the United States lives in urban areas. We're considered rural, so we're an oddity. People were attracted to the cities because they saw them as opportunities for economic growth and prosperity. And the thing of it is, too, is a lot of people from the Northeast, especially New England, they left the farms. They used to be subsistence farmers, or they would produce commercial agriculture, but they found that they couldn't compete any longer with agricultural products that are being produced in the Midwest, because in the Midwest they're growing these cash crops, large amount of cash crops. Wheat and corn and other things, right? So a lot of people are drawn there. Immigrants are drawn there as well. So the problems, as I said, there's slums, there's overcrowding, there's poor housing, there's difficult to find affordable housing, you have infectious disease, you have crimes, you have rats, you have all sorts of things that's taking place there. So these rich people who don't want to be there, they move out to the suburbs. So we already start to see the growth of the suburbs, and you're going to have these very wealthy neighborhoods that are outside of the cities. Included in the North, too, were about 250,000 freed African Americans by 1860, the start of the Civil War. They made up only 1% of the population of the North at that time, but that made up 50% of the entire free black population. So what that means that there was another 250,000 free black people living in the South. Um, we're probably thinking, why would you live in the South during this time if you're black? Wouldn't you go to the North? But they were free. They had to show their papers at all time. And to be honest with you, in the North, they also suffered from racial prejudice and discrimination, as you can see right here. The laws were such that they were denied the right to vote in many places, to get certain jobs. They had difficulty finding work. They were displaced by immigrants coming in. And there's this slogan, last hired, first fired. They were used, if people went on strike, then black people would be hired to do the job of white people. But then once these white people came back to work, then they would be let go. And of course, white people didn't like them for that. So life was very difficult and challenging for them. And then they ended up living in small enclaves where the majority of people were black. And then you'd have black owned businesses and they'd cater to one another. And then that would grow over time. All right, so what we see, you see these links between the North and then what is the Midwest. And then that's right up here. Very few transportation links go from north to south. Most of them go from east to west up there. And included in that, you have roads and you have canals and you have railroads that start to emerge at that time. So we get all 6 of those states that came out of the old Northwest, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then to some extent, Minnesota really wasn't part of it. There was a small part of it that was up there because a lot of Minnesota is on the other side of the Mississippi River. So all of those came in, and then when the transportation links were created, then trade would go back and forth. From the Midwest would come agricultural products, and then finished products, military or manufactured products would go out there to Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. So they're closely connected, and as the book said, it was because of military commands or campaigns by federal troops, and then also the building of these transportation networks, mostly the transportation networks. All right, so agriculture in the Midwest, the Northeast really couldn't compete. Of course, it is very fertile in Pennsylvania, but here in the Midwest, they were producing a large number of crops, a large amount of crops for profit, specifically corn and wheat, very fertile soil, flat land, so they could produce that. Plus, we have new innovations, the steel plow, the mechanical reaper, those sorts of things that are being developed. I talk about that in the previous chapter, chapter 8. So hopefully you can listen to that before you take the test over what period are we in? Period 4, right? So there's that, and transportation links. So they're producing these goods and they're shipping them to the east and then maybe even to Europe. As a result. So there's trade that's going on. So these are all links. And eventually the Midwest is going to become known as the breadbasket of America because so much food is produced here. All right, so Midwestern cities too also emerge, even though New York's not really in the Midwest, but it's located right up here. There's Buffalo, right? And then Cleveland, Ohio. I don't see it on this map. But then, of course, you're going to get Detroit, and then you're going to get Chicago. You're going to get St. Louis. You're going to get Cincinnati. Oh, what do we have there? I don't see them on the map here, but I'm sure they're there. So all of these cities that didn't even exist 10 years prior are going to start to show up as transportation links them to other locations of the country, especially if they're on rivers and if they're on lakes, then they are going to start to emerge. Another thing that is occurring in the north, it's not so much in the south or in the west, is immigration. People are immigrating here to the United States in droves. Our population is doubling every 25 years by the middle of the century. And most of these people are drawn to these urban centers, especially the Irish. So the period of time that we're talking about is right in here. It may not seem like much in comparison to this and this, but at the time, based on the population of the country, it was huge, right? They were really coming in, and the cities were becoming very densely populated. So they go to these large urban centers looking for work. Like I said, especially the Irish. The Germans, not so much. They have more money, and they go further west. So they come out here, especially to the Midwest, and they buy land and they have farms. So as I said, there are a lot of problems when they move into these cities. There's poverty, the water's dirty, there's rats, there's not a good police force. It's just so much of an onslaught at one time that the cities can't keep up with that. There's also a very high natural population growth rate in the country on top of the immigration. So the cities are just exploding in size. All right, so a lot of the reasons why people are coming here is many people in Europe thought that Europe was running out of room. Their population had increased as well, and they're seeking freedom from sort of an oppressive system that they had in place. There's still monarchies in many countries there, and you have the system of nobility. They're still run by state churches, and so they want new opportunities. They want economic opportunity. They want more liberties and freedoms. Also, transportation had been improved at the time, and so a lot of people come to the United States looking for a better life. So they come here. They come to the United States, but there's other places as well. A lot of people are just leaving Europe. All right, so if you look at it here, the majority of the people who are coming to the United States at this time are from Ireland and from Germany. And so you can look at that. Notice in Ireland, about 1851 to 1860, this is where it really peaks. And you guessed it, this is because of the potato famine. But during that same year, there's a large number of people coming from Germany. And that's because they had a failed revolution there, and those numbers just continue to increase. Now, Ireland is an island, and they didn't have that many people to start with. So a huge chunk of people were leaving that country. I love this map. I've shown it to you before. If you look on it, the light blue, that is German. So the German population really did dominate in much of the United States. It doesn't mean that they make up all of the population. It's just that all the groups, they are the majority in those counties on this map. And this map, I think it was 2010. All right, so we do have some large population centers, but I want you to look here because the next one is going to show 1860. So at this time, you still have large cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Detroit is not on this map. Chicago is, and St. Louis is, Louisville, Cincinnati, and New Orleans, but not much, west of, well, not much west of the Appalachian Mountains, really. And then there's a big shift. Look how rapidly Chicago grows, Milwaukee, Detroit. We've got Cincinnati, Cleveland, Louisville, New Orleans. It's just an explosion in just 40 years. It's just a huge transformation. So this slide right here, the graph to the left, it indicates the people who are coming here between 1820 and 1860. It kind of contradicts the chart that I just previously showed you because it shows that the Irish were the larger number because the Germans came in during a tighter window and then their numbers started to decline, whereas Ireland, they continued to come to the United States. Both were coming and making up huge chunks of our population. But with the Irish, they were treated very poorly. I know my side of the family, at least on my dad's side, they came during this time, and they ended up in Chicago, and many of them worked on the railroad and that sort of thing, eventually ended up in Galesburg. But they fled because the bleak circumstances that existed in Ireland at the time, and many people left because of the potato famine. The Irish became very dependent upon the potato. The potato, as you know, is an indigenous crop to the Andes Mountains, but it grew very well, and it still does in Ireland. But it is estimated that a young man would eat about 14 pounds of potatoes a day. That's just how dependent they were upon the potato for their diet. It was just that important. But a blight hit it, and we'll talk about that in the next slide in a minute. And it just pretty much brought Ireland to its knees because the people just went without food. But anyway, they come here and they're treated very poorly. Help wanted, Irish need not apply. People just didn't want the Irish. They were seen as kind of animalistic. Right there in the minds of many Americans, as with African Americans. Oftentimes, the Irish would be used in the South for hard labor rather than a slave because you didn't want your slave to get injured, right? So they would suffer that not only because many of them were ill-educated, they were poor, they were Catholic, and so they just weren't thought of very highly when they came here. Girls, that kind of a typical name for an Irish man was Patrick, and girls was Bridget. So we have biddies and patties and that sort of thing. Eventually, though, their numbers are so large that they become the majority in many communities in northern cities, and they start to control politics. And one of them, if you look here at the bottom, is Tammany Hall, and that became very powerful in the latter part of the 19th century. So I want you to look at this graph. It's going to take a minute to understand it. This blue line right here, this indicates Europe's population, and it's looked at it by these numbers over here, going up all the way to 1990. So Europe's population estimated to be close to 760 million people. I don't know that it's that high. But anyway, this is Ireland's population right here, the green line. Now notice right here, it starts to go down. This was with the potato famine in the 1840s right here. So that's when their population starts to go down. Notice at that peak, they had 8 million people, right, when the potato famine hit. Then over here, if you look at their numbers, quote unquote, now they have 5.5 million. So they have not recovered since the potato famine. I was there probably about 10 years ago. And for many people in Ireland, there's not very many economic opportunities. So people are still leaving. They're coming here. When you go up to Chicago, you talk to people and they have Irish accents. So they're still leaving because they're seeking economic opportunities. But Ireland is trying to do things to entice business to Ireland so that they can get people to stay. It's a beautiful country, but not too many natural resources. All right, so here's a little bit more about the famine. So there's a blight that came through and it infected the potato crop. And as I said, this was devastating for them because they relied upon it so much. So an average man would consume 14 pounds of potatoes a day and eat them 3 times a day. And so the blight hit in September of 1845, and it just blackened everything. It just wiped out the crop, and it continued for 2 years, and that's what they relied upon. England and the United States and other countries would send in like corn and then some other crops, but people suffered from scurvy. So after the second year, you can see here the effects. People couldn't pay for the rents, they're evicted from their home, and then people start to die from starvation and then other diseases. This is what the diseases they talk about is black fever. It's typhus, and it's spread by lice throughout, and about 2 million people die. Then another 1.5 to 2 million people leave. And so they leave. Many of them come here to the United States, about 1 million of them. They go to other locations too. They go to Canada, and they're on these typhus ships lined up at the St. Lawrence River waiting to get off. But while they're on this ship, or these ships, many people die. About 20% of the population on these ships die just waiting to immigrate into Canada. All right, excuse me. So as I said, they do form their own organizations, and one of them is the Order of the Hibernians, right? So this is an organization that took its name from some American Indian tribal leader. They established that in 1789. So that was pretty late or early in terms of the potato famine. So this was established already, and it started out as a men's organization, but pretty soon they took over Tammany Hall, which was a location in New York City. And from there, they became very powerful. And when new Irish immigrants would come in, they would help to find them jobs and get them settled, but they'd have to support them and their political party. And so it became a political machine that controlled a good chunk of New York City. Germans also came, and they came in huge numbers. Look at that, big family right there. They immigrated from 1830 to 1860. A lot of them are seeking religious freedom. They're also escaping revolutions that are occurring in Germany at the time. A lot of them come here to the Midwest. I know that the Wessels on my dad's side of the family, they went down to southern Illinois. They had money, they were educated, very different than the Irish. Um, they also contributed a great deal to American culture, right? The Conestoga wagon, Christmas, kindergarten, all these different things were something that were influenced by the Germans. They were also abolitionists for the most part. And they had various different religious beliefs. I know in Southern Illinois, you get a large group of Germans who are Lutheran, a large group that are Catholic, right? One thing that astounded this sort of Puritan tradition in America is that they drank beer on Sundays, and then they would have large social gatherings on the day of rest, right? And so that's called the Continental Sunday. It was part of the German culture. If you look here, the mosaic where they most settled, if you look up in Wisconsin, up there, large German population there. They're more sparse in the south than they are in the north and in the west. But that was that one map that we looked at too, right? Because of all this immigration, there's this nativist sentiment that emerged. These are people who are alarmed by the large numbers, and so it's anti-immigration. People are opposed to immigrants, they're opposed to Catholics, and they call for immigration restrictions. They even, what they do is they have their own organization. This is the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. They have a secret code, like, somebody wants to get in, who's there? I know nothing, right? So that was their secret code for entrance. They had anti-immigration, anti-Catholic activities, and they even ran people for office. Here in 1856, if you look, the American Know-Nothings under Millard Fillmore, who would also become a Whig, you can see in the gray, got, what is that, 22% of the popular vote. So that was kind of sort of a belief that swept through America at that time. They felt as if American culture was changing too rapidly, and so that's the effect of it. And then here, natives of the soil arouse. American labor needs to be protected. So that was another reason for support of that. People felt as if you needed leverage against the immigrants to hold on to your jobs. All right, let's move on now to the South. And of course, here we're going to talk a lot about slavery. There are a lot of pictures that we're going to be going through here. All right, so there are a lot of challenges for the South. There's a graph over here. You can see the production of cotton increased rapidly from 1793. And the reason for that, of course, was the cotton gin created by Eli Whitney. What it did, they tried to grow cotton before, but you had to pick the cotton and then you had to separate the seed from the cotton. It was very time consuming and it just wasn't worthwhile to plant it. But then Eli Whitney, he went down and he lived, he was from he was from Massachusetts, and he went down to the South and he lived with the widow of, because friends of the family of Nathaniel Greene, the general from the Revolutionary War. And she and, I don't know, the plantation manager were telling Eli Whitney how difficult it was to grow cotton and produce it and make it viable. And so what he did, he kind of tinkered around, and he had done this growing up on the farm. With his father, with this thing where there's teeth that go through like this. So the teeth will move together, and as they do, they'll move the fibers of cotton through, but remove the seed. And all you have to do is crank it like this with a little hand crank, and you could clean the cotton of the seed. And then it makes it a lot easier to plant this. So you could grow different strains of cotton and separate it that way. So now more and more people are growing cotton, and this works out really well because in the north, they're making clothes. So cotton is sent from the south to the north, and it's also sent to England. And by 1860, it makes up 57% of all U.S. exports. So cotton is king, and the South thinks that this is their leverage in the Civil War to get England in on their side, right? It's slow to develop. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not. They're slow, though, in the South to develop other industry. They're kind of trapped in an agrarian society. There is some textile manufacturing that's taking place down there and a few other things, but they don't have the banks. They don't have the other manufacturing that the North does. So they're going to have to buy their products from the North or from elsewhere because the only thing they're producing in the South are agricultural products, and they're not even developing good transportation networks either. It's going to hurt them when they go to war. All right, so slavery is a very important aspect of Southern culture at this time. And you have seen this before in the North, and sorry, some of it's been cut off. In the North, a lot of states are starting to abolish slavery, but the South just holds on to it. Right? Then we're going to get the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, as they're growing cotton and tobacco, they're depleting the soil, so there's continued westward expansion in the South. But because of the Missouri Compromise line, it said there would be no slavery past the 3630 line. And of course, this was something that Henry Clay negotiated. Missouri would have slavery, though, but all those areas in blue would not. This was made to maintain that balance of power between slave state and free state. So there really wasn't much further for the South to expand, given the territory that there was at that time. All right, so if we look at Southern society, you had those elite people at the top. These are the aristocracy of the South. They're the ones that owned those large plantations. They also controlled government. The largest chunk of people, the majority, were the plain folk, right? These were white yeoman farmers. And the majority of people in the South owned no slaves, right? Three-fourths of the people in the South had no slaves. Then you had black freemen, 250,000, just like in the North, there's 250,000 freed blacks up there. And then you had black slaves that made up over 3 million people. So the U.S. population at this time is 23 million people. The South, though, had 40% of that. So a much larger population in the North than in the South. And in the South, 3 million plus are slaves. All right, so Southern whites, if you look at that, you had the aristocracy, as I said before, and wealth was determined by how much land you had and how many slaves you had. So this group of people, they owned more than 100 slaves, and they farmed more than 1,000 acres. So they were very wealthy. They were the ones that were elected to political office, and so they controlled government and they controlled the laws that were passed that favored them. Then you had farmers. This was the vast majority of people down there. They owned of slave owners, sorry, not of people. The majority of people were poor whites. So you had these yeoman farmers that had slaves. They're the majority of people who had slaves, right? And they owned about 20 slaves and they farmed about several hundred acres. And they're the bulk of the people who produced cotton, but they had to work it themselves. They weren't these wealthy elite people who had slaves and overseers and everyone else working for them. But so they were very important. But then you had the poor whites. These are known as poor white trash, hillbillies. They made up the bulk of the white population. Three-fourths of the Southern population, and they owned no slaves. So the majority of people in the South who were white had no slaves. Only 25% of the white population did. Then you had the mountain people. Now, some people have even called them clay eaters because even though you had the poor white trash, these people were poor. They lived in the Appalachian Mountains and the Ozark Mountains along the lines of that, and they really had no liking or no love at all for the plantation owners or for slaves. And as a matter of fact, they owed their allegiance to the United States government, and they would continue that allegiance during the Civil War. As a matter of fact, the people of West Virginia are going to separate from Virginia and form their own state during the Civil War when Virginia secedes. All right, so here's another way of looking at it. You've got the small number of white slaveholders. They make up 1/4 of the population. Then you have the planter class. They were the elite in society. Um, and then you had, among all of these people, the slave owner population and others as well, they had this weird way of thinking of things. You had a code of honor, a code of chivalry. Manners were very important. You could only partake in acceptable professions, the military, agriculture, maybe the law, but not banking or business or those sorts of things. They were unacceptable in the South. So here again, the slave owning population, that's only 25% of the population. Most of the people who owned slaves only owned 1 to 4 slaves. And then you have maybe about 20% who owned 5 to 9%, maybe another, I don't know, what is that, like 15% owned 10 to 19 slaves. There are only a very small percent, I'd say maybe 5% of the population who own more than 50 slaves. And this is another way of looking at it. Again, this is the slave owning population. Most people owned no slaves. Okay, so slavery, it's what they referred to as the peculiar institution, and I'm not going to repeat too much of this, but as I already said, the cotton gin, it's created in 1793, and this encourages the growth of cotton and the expansion of slavery. You can see that the number of slaves goes up from 1 million slaves in 1800 to 4 million by 1860. Most of this is natural population growth, but people are defying the law against international slave trade and smuggling slaves into the country. Wealth was determined, as I said, by land and slaves that you had, the number that you had, and whites start to get very sensitive to the institution of slavery because more and more people are calling for its abolition. And so rather than calling it slavery, they call it the peculiar institution of the South. And they also justified why white people should dominate over black people based upon racial prejudices and their notion of white superiority. All right, so in the South, we had about 250,000 freed blacks. They stayed in the South. They saw it as their home. They also wanted to be close to their family. They got free because they were manumitted by their owners, maybe because they were their children, right? Sometimes they purchased their freedom. I know I've been to slave plantations, old slave plantations, and they'll talk about how slaves sometimes would have gardens and they would sell their wares. Sometimes they had a skilled trade and sometimes they would get paid to do different things, so they earned money. Maybe you were a seamstress or something like that, and you eventually save up and you buy your freedom. Some people had been emancipated as a result of the American Revolution. So a lot of those people who were freed lived in cities. They were restricted as they were in the North. As you can see, they couldn't buy property, they couldn't vote, and they were banned from certain occupations. All right, this right here shows the slave population in various states. If you go to Mississippi and also South Carolina, you can see that they made up the majority of the population. Right, and then this area right here, where it's in the dark red, this is something that they call the Black Belt. So it comes down this way and then it goes here and it's along the Mississippi River. So this is what they call the Black Belt. We can see it today in political elections, right? If you look right here, this is a 2008 presidential election. In the blue right there, that's vote for the Democratic Party. And that was the year that Barack Obama ran for office. Right? And then this is 2004. You can see the same thing. This was, let's see, George Bush and what's it, John Kerry at that time. So Democrats or many black people in the United States have a tendency to vote for Democrats. Okay, so in the southern agriculture, you can see the short fiber cotton that's grown in the yellow, and that then they can grow that and separate the fiber from the seed, and they continue to go westward all the way into Texas. This is important because those people in Texas are going to declare themselves the Lone Star State before long. Corn is grown in the area of blue, and then tobacco now is pushed further west, but you still get it up around the Chesapeake area of Richmond and areas there, but then also out in Kentucky and Tennessee. Here's an image of a plantation. People are picking cotton. Here you can see this is an image of a cotton gin. The one guy is turning the crank, and then another guy is waiting for the cotton to come into the basket there, while somebody's dumping bales into the crank, and then it's being separated from the seed. Right, so here's cotton production in 1820, where it's being grown. And then look at that, 40 years later, it's being grown all the way into Texas. Right, the value of the cotton exports as a percent of all U.S. exports increases exponentially. And as I told you before, it makes up 57% of total exports by 1860, actually 57.5%. Another image hauling the week's pickings to the market. This right here, though, is another thing that slaves had to do. They'd work in here. This is a sugar boiling house. That would have been very hard work. It's very labor intensive. It's very hot, and in the South under some extreme conditions. Again, in the fields. And then here, slaves buying and selling. Probably the worst fear of most slaves is the fact that they could be sold and shipped away from their family. Here's somebody up on the auction block, a few somebodies, a woman and a child. This right here is the slave market in Charleston, South Carolina. I went there a couple of years ago, and they've converted it to a museum. I'm not sure what I expected to see. Somebody up on I don't know, an auction block. I didn't expect that, but I thought that I would see what it was really like, but they've kind of blocked all of that off, and they just have like different things that you could read. It's like reading a textbook, so it wasn't that much fun. Look at these way that people were treated. This person has a muzzle and then also a chain around his neck, a leash, kind of like a dog. They would do this for indentured servants too. That had been something that had kind of continued on from indentured servitude. So those things up on the top, those are branding irons. Sometimes slaves would be branded, so just like a cow would be branded, so people would know who you quote unquote belong to. Here is a tag in the top left corner, kind of like a dog collar. You have to have a tag there. Some shoes at the top right, and then shekels on the bottom left. This is an anti-slave pamphlet showing how these people are being branded. That would have to hurt. Oftentimes, what would happen when people didn't do what they were told, they would be whipped. There would be an overseer in charge of everybody, and I'm sorry about the format on this slide. I'll have to go in and fix it. But there were very few laws, if any, that protected slaves. This person just did not want to do what he was told to do, right? Or maybe he just had a really horrible overseer. And strict laws governed over the slaves, and it gave slave owners the right to do these sorts of things. So here's another image. This is these are slaves posing out in front of their cabin. This is slave cabin in 1862 during the Civil War. This is the image that Hollywood kind of projected of the South. This is in Gone with the Wind. This is the plantation Tara, and that is Scarlett O'Hara. And then here she has a slave woman, a domestic, Mamie, who's taking care of her. In many cases, there was a nanny for the children, and the nannies would raise these children. The children often love their nannies. This is kind of like the movie The Help, right? So this has been going on for a long time in the South. Here's another picture. This was taken during the Civil War. The Library of Congress did it. Government commissioned people to go down and do a study of what was going on in the South and areas that had been liberated. Here's some slave quarters kind of lined up there on a plantation at Port Royal Island, South Carolina. This was taken in 1862. Again, Library of Congress had this. Here you can look and see buying and selling of the slaves. Matilda Selby, 9, $400, sold to Mr. Covington for $425. Brooks Selby, 19, $750, left at home because he's crazy, I guess. Fred McAfee, 22, $800, sold to Pepperell for $1,200. And so on and so forth. Your book says that the price for a young, quote, male slave, well, buck is what they would call them, like they were a deer or something, was $2,000. Every other book I've ever seen has been about $1,000. And that equates to, in modern day money, to about $30,000 to $40,000. So if you have a whole bunch of slaves, imagine that's like owning a whole fleet of cars. So here, again, this shows the price up to about 800. So I'm not sure where the book gets 2,000. You'd be at peak, like at the age of 20, 25, and through there. All right, this image, slavery got to be so controversial. This is something that's going to happen in 1856, and this has to do with Southern chivalry. Preston Brooks beats this Senator Charles Sumner because Sumner had insulted his uncle. So he could go challenge him to a duel, but he thought he wasn't worthy of that. So he just gets a cane and he goes and he beats him on the Senate floor. Southerners, I hear, sent him more canes. Charles Sumner, though, for his part, was a great abolitionist. He suffered brain damage from this. I mean, he was severely injured as a result of this beating. It was a horrible beating right there on the Senate floor. So this is going to show you how tensions increase so much over the institution of slavery. All right, U.S. laws that govern slavery or regulate it, most of them now, of course, all of these have been rescinded because it's no longer relevant, but they were in the Constitution in terms of slavery could not be outlawed until 1808. There is a Three-Fifths Compromise in Article 1, Section 2, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and then there would be strengthened Fugitive Slave Clause, one in 1793 and then the one in 1850, which is going to infuriate the North. So keep that in the back of your mind before we get up there. Okay, so if you look at it in the South, the slavery in the South is an oddity because everywhere else they're banning it, right? In 1780s, we get an anti-slavery society in Philadelphia. In 1804, slavery is eliminated from the last northern state. 1808, no more international slave trade. 1820, the republics of South and Central America, they're now free. They abolish slavery. 1833, slavery is abolished throughout the British Empire. 1844, slavery is abolished in all the French colonies. Finally, well, 1861, serfs in Russia, those are slaves, not based on race, they are emancipated. So we're not going to get the abolition of slavery until the 13th Amendment, which is going to be ratified in 1865. All right, so slavery was it really wasn't very efficient in the US as it was elsewhere, right? Because there was a high cost of keeping your slaves from escaping. It was they had to put a lot into it. So what they wanted to do is raise that cost, right? So there's slave patrols, there's black codes, and what they would do is if you disobey, you would get whipped, but you could cut off a piece of the ear, a piece of the toe, a piece of the foot, so that you would be reminded not to do what you had done before. And that would try to encourage others to do what they're supposed to do. All right, so we know what these slave codes look like. You couldn't own land. You couldn't leave the plantation. You couldn't go out at night. You couldn't congregate except to go to church. You couldn't carry a weapon. You couldn't hit a white person. You were prohibited from marrying. They would do like these symbolic marriages where they do this kind of sort of ceremony, and then you would jump over a broom, and that sort of thing marked the wedding at that time. If you had any black blood in you at all, you were still considered a slave. The way that most slaves resisted was usually sabotage or just slowing down their work. And just kind of taking your time. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, master. And just going slow as you can. And then, of course, the master would get frustrated with you and everything else. Sometimes they would escape. It was very difficult. And you know that if you were captured, horrible things could happen to you. And then sometimes there were revolts, not very often. Okay, because of this attitude, black people slowing down the work, they've kind of gotten this stereotype in America of being a Sambo, somebody who's lazy, taking their time, stupid, right? But we know that what they did was probably very intelligent, very smart in a way of protesting, but that stereotype continued in American history. This is an advertisement for smoking cigarettes back, I think this is like in the 1920s. And then watermelon had been associated with black people too. It's a racial stereotype as well. All right, so there were some slave revolts. There's a couple of men who initiated them here, Gabriel Prosser on the left and Denmark Vesey on the right. So there were some slave rebellions. And here's a list of them. One early on, 1712, a guy goes into an outhouse in New York, and black people set it on fire, and this just creates this whole big slave revolt back in 1712. The Stono Rebellion is probably the most noted. Let me go to the next slide. This shows where there were some important slave revolts. And this shows it right here, what happened. So you see the Stono one, blacks come together in their Stono River in North Carolina, and they kind of go on this killing rampage, killing about 50, well, it says here 75 to 80 people were involved, but they killed between 25 and 50 American white, or well, they're all American white deaths, right? And then there's the Prosser one. 40 blacks were involved in this one, no white dead, 35 were executed. The Louisiana Revolt, this one, 66 killed in battle, 16 executed, 17 escaped. I think this is the one where they put their heads on stakes and lined them outside the community to teach people don't do this again. So it's pretty awful. Denmark Vesey, he had actually gotten some money apparently from a lottery, and there's historical debate about this. The mayor of the community maybe didn't, he wanted to elevate his own status, and so he kind of initiated or said that there was this revolt, and he went against this guy because now this black man has money, right? So they said that he initiated this revolt, and many historians don't believe that was true. But anyway, there are 49 condemned of this revolt, 12 people pardoned, 37 people hanged, and not one white person was dead. Right. Nat Turner's revolt, black people, 70 involved, 57 white deaths, right? 20 conspirators were executed, including Nat Turner. 100 or more were killed in mass reprisals. The Black Seminole Rebellion, these are Native Americans and African Americans working together. This is also a time when they're trying to remove the Seminole from their land and push them into Oklahoma. And then there's the Second Seminole War that's going to take place 1835 to 1838. Yeah, there's two different wars, same time period. All right, and then there's slave rebellions throughout South America. There's an image. If we look at slave culture, a whole different culture developed on these plantations, the way they practiced religion, their music, their language, their family unit. They had very tight families. A lot of people think that they didn't, but they did, but they were torn apart by the institution of slavery. They became very devout. Many were baptized during the First Great Awakening, and they converted to Christianity, mostly Baptist, but also Methodist. They spoke Gola English or Pidgin English, and it's like he be, you is, so subject verb agreement doesn't always mesh, and it's a combination of African English and other dialects kind of put together. Excuse me. Music was very important to them. They would sing while they work in the fields, and so that kind of created the blues. That's going to evolve into jazz, which of course is going to evolve into rock and roll. But while you're out there in the fields, you're going to start singing because that helps the time to pass. All right, so white Southerners, they supported it. Here's an image. They're showing if the Negro were left to his own, he'd be in Africa hunting on the I don't know, the Serengeti or whatever, but instead they're living a civilized life as seen in the right in this posh home, right? Which of course very few slaves got to live that lifestyle. Here, John C. Calhoun, he wrote a disquisition on government. He said, state of nature, men are born free. It doesn't exist. All men are born subject to social and political authority. He gives a speech on abolition petitions. Southern states couldn't surrender their institution of slavery. They just become entrenched in it, right, as a result of this. Okay, so what we're going to get is the American Colonization Society, and what this was, it was established in which they would gradually free Black people and then send them back to Africa. So some very noted people were in this: Clay, Webster, Madison, Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln were members of the American Colonization Society. Their goal was to send people back to Liberia, and the capital was Monrovia. It was named after Monroe, the President of the United States, the fifth President of the United States. But anyway, so the desire was to send freed Black people there. Their foreign or their official language now in that country is English, and their monetary unit is the dollar. And the people who control that country are descendants of freed slaves from the United States. All right, real quickly, the West. So the West is kind of this elusive place, and it just keeps changing as America develops. It used to be West during Jamestown. When Jamestown was established, is where Richmond is, right? And then West was at the Alleghenies or the Appalachian Mountains, and then it was on the other side of the mountains. At this time, it's west of the Mississippi River, right? So people who move west, they live very isolated lifestyles. They're seeking land and opportunity out there. It's very difficult. Um, kind of developed this notion of rugged individualism. People romanticize about it, how you overcome all of these obstacles out there on your own in this sedentary life. And it's seen in the literature, as I talk about here. Natty Bumppo, the character in the Leather Stocking Tales, James Fenimore Cooper, or in Herman Melville's Captain Ahab. They're overcoming nature, right? It's man against nature. So they do suffer from isolation, but not only that, hunger, the elements, disease, very rarely, but sometimes Native American attacks. Okay, so eastern lands were depleted, so more and more people are moving out west. They go to Kentucky and places like that. They trade out in the west with Native Americans and other people. You have frontiersmen. They're trading beaver skins, buffalo robes, all sorts of different things. Some people call this ecological imperialism because they're extracting all of these resources from the environment. One person who paints of this at that time was George Catlin. So he's going out there, different sort of style in his artwork. You can see it right here. Here you have Native Americans. They have taken the horse and adjust it to what they do in hunting bison, right? And here they are doing that. To an extreme. Normally, Native Americans wouldn't have killed that many bison, but they were given reward in doing that by white men because they thought, well, if we get rid of the bison or the buffalo, then we get rid of the Indian. But here's some Catlin images of Native Americans. I think those are pretty cool paintings. Here's another one. This is the Missouri River. Here are some Native Americans. This person, I'm not exactly sure what the date is on this image, but it could have been like that 1,000 years ago. People lived a nomadic lifestyle out on the plains, and so they had to have teepees, something that they could take down very quickly and move because they're moving around. But for Native Americans living at this time, most of them lived west of the Mississippi River because they were pushed westward. There are also, those people who survived the diseases that ran through America at that time. There's also military campaigns to fight them as they were trying to fight for their own land. So they're forced off of their ancestral lands, or they just move westward to escape the encroachment on their land. Life is difficult there. They hunt bison. They are nomadic. What we're going to see, though, in 1830, there's going to be the Indian Removal Act. We'll learn about that in the next chapter. And then also there's the Indian Reservation System, 1850, where they start to put Native Americans on reservations. White settlers go out there, and as I said, they live a very isolated lifestyle. We're almost finished, people. This is it. You got mountain men who are um, up in the mountains, and they're hunting and trapping, doing that sort of thing. Women, they work right there alongside men. Most people, though, they have short lifespans out there. They don't live a long time because life is hard. And also, there's a lot of environmental damage taking place as people go out there. They hack down trees, they deplete the soil, so they, hunt animals to near extinction. So there are certainly some perils that come with settling the West. So I'm going to stop now. Gone long enough. Thank you for listening.